Voxfarm presents.
What do you know about Franz Liszt? You'll certainly have heard that he was a famous virtuoso pianist and composer. Perhaps you don't know that during the last years of his life, he spent long periods at Villa d'Este, the beautiful 16th-century villa in Tivoli, near Rome. If you'd like to learn more about these mysterious visits, listen to our podcast, written by Martina Santese.
Welcome to Lirica, the podcast about Italy's cultural heritage. We'll tell you about works of art and artists, musical masterpieces and musicians. We'll visit incredible places and meet characters from every era. They'll tell us about their lives and even a bit about our own. Because culture is simple when it speaks the language of beauty.
A brilliant and theatrical performer, an intimate and meditative composer, a dandy who was popular with women, a very religious man who at 54 decided to take minor orders, becoming an abbot. Liszt, throughout his long life, was everything and the opposite of everything. Arturo Toscanini loved to say of himself that he had too much of the absolute in my heart. Perhaps Franz also had a little too much of the absolute, excesses and contrasts that he expressed naturally and continuously. He went to Tivoli for the first time in 1865 as a guest of Cardinal Gustav Adolf Hohenlohe, a cultured and generous man, and sponsor of the arts, who at that time lived in Villa d'Este as a guest of the Habsburgs. Some people are just born lucky. On this first visit, Liszt only stayed a short while, but from then on, he returned to Tivoli every year. It's likely he fell in love with the beauty and charm of the area. To use his own words, to escape from the excessiveness of the minute obligations of puerile and honest civilization of Rome. It would seem that his relationship with the Eternal City at that time was not as happy as it could be. After being very much in love with it, he felt betrayed. His plan to reform sacred music did not find favor with Pope Pius IX. And even his troubled relationship with his lover, Princess Caroline Zussein-Wittgenstein, was at a low ebb. At Tivoli, he could put some distance between himself and everything else. At Villa d'Este, he had an apartment on the top floor of the palazzo, a little refuge that he affectionately referred to as Mon Colombier, my dovecote, on a card he wrote to his pupil, Giovanni Sgambati. He only had a few simply furnished rooms, a bedroom, a lounge where he took his meals, and at the back, a music room. This music room had very special characteristics. It was round, small, with a warm and cozy atmosphere. It was noted for its hand-painted floral wallpaper, which depicted the miracle of bread and roses of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. This is why the room is called the Rose Room. And Franz's instrument, an Erard grand piano, which was very difficult to move in, was always positioned in front of the little window that opened onto the gardens and the endless valley that stretches out towards Rome. The musicians' first trips to Tivoli were brief summer affairs, but soon Franz began to stay longer at Villa d'Este, until he was habitually staying there for around 3 months of each year, from 8th September to 1st December, even if Hohenlohe wasn't there. Liszt found the peace and quiet he needed in the Italian garden. Beneath the dense foliage of the pines and from the intense greens of the cypresses, and the quiet trickle of the constantly flowing waters that made up the thousands of streams of the fountains. The maestro adored the villa, recalled his only student in Tivoli, Filippo Guglielmi. And he spent long hours there in perfect solitude, walking and thinking, especially in the early morning or at sunset, after working in his secluded studio or praying in the palazzo's chapel. Two young girls, daughters of one of the villa's handymen, worked in his service at that time, and in 1925, then elderly women described him in an affectionate and touching tribute. How he played, they remembered. We always went there to listen. He was always happy. He was such a good man. He really liked having his meals served on the terrace. He always smoked a lot of cigars, one after the other. Sometimes he got a little lost in thought. He had a faraway look in his eye, and his cigar fell from his hand onto the floor, where there were always lots of these half-wasted cigars. In the quiet solitude of Villa d'Este, Franz found stimulation and concentration, and some of his great masterpieces were composed in his rose room. In the summer of 1877, he wrote in a letter to Caroline, "I've spent the whole of these last 3 days under the cypresses. It's impossible to do anything else, even in church. The old trunks greet me, and I heard the branches filled with evergreen foliage crying. Finally, they're done, set out on music paper, and after making lots of corrections, crossings out, recrossings out, and copies, I'm giving up and not touching them again." The two Au cyprès de la Villa d'Est, Les Jeux d'eau à la Villa d'Est, the variations on a theme of Bach, the Deux Légendes, St. Francis of Assisi's Sermon of the Birds, and St. Francis of Paula walking on the waves, and the two concert études, Forest Murmurs and Dance of the Gnomes, are some of the compositions for piano written at Tivoli, and the monumental oratorio Christus was also largely composed at Villa d'Este. Guglielmi writes of Liszt in his memoirs. Almost all of the Christus oratorio was composed at Tivoli. In this regard, I remember that he was extremely interested in Lazio folklore. And as he was composing the Christmas section, he invited the famous Trociari pipers, who came to Tivoli around the Christmas period, to the porch beneath his apartment, using their tunes in one of the section's themes. Liszt was particularly fond of Tivoli. He often walked through the town's streets, where he was always greeted with the greatest respect. The illustrious stranger's good looks and exquisite charm immediately won over the town's inhabitants, and the commander, as they called him, was a familiar and welcome face. Liszt enjoyed great popularity in Tivoli, Angelini Giustiniani wrote in an article, and on his name day, the feast of St. Francis, the town's representatives came to give him their wishes. He sent equally affectionate wishes to the city that welcomed him. Liszt also appreciated the local specialty food and drink, like the famous Pizzutello grapes, and he had a particular predilection for a wine from Zagarolo, a nearby town. Filippo Guglielmi recalls, Liszt arrived in Tivoli on the day of the Nativity of Mary, 8th September, accompanied by his faithful Montenegrin servant, Spiridion. On arrival, he got off the stagecoach, which took no less than 5 hours from Rome, and went to the Hotel Trattoria della Pace on Trevio Square, managed by Mr. Andrea Frittelli, stopping short the small talk with a clear question. Avez-vous du Zagarolo? Have you any Zagarolo? Mr. Andrea was in fact the maestro's wine supplier, and he was proud of that, and always kept back his beloved Zagarolo. During his trips to Villa d'Este, Liszt's regular visitors, especially in the later years, were Mr. Tomei, the town mayor, and Mr. Pezzina, the director of the municipal band and a good musician. It wasn't unusual for him to go out in the evening, Guglielmi writes. He went out to visit some of Tivoli's wealthiest families, the Tomeis, the Trinchieris, the Guglielmis, who did everything to entertain their illustrious guest. It's impossible to get a sense of the generosity and deference he showed his friends in Tivoli. The lone elderly gentleman appreciated their warmth and instant affection. And he showed that these feelings were reciprocated by playing for them so much. Sometimes he arrived in Tivoli with some of his students, musicians from all over the world. In the latter years of his life, teaching was very important to him. He didn't give paid lessons, his American pupil Amy Faye recalled. He was too great for that. But if you had enough talent, you could go and play something for him. Every now and again, he'd give his opinion, play a passage, and with just a few words, he'd give you something to think about for the rest of your life. Tausig, von Bülow, Nikolai and Anton Rubinstein, Giovanni Sgambati, Stradal, and Janka Woll. These are just some of the most famous names among his numerous students. He preferred letting their potential unfold naturally, promoting their music and, if necessary, supporting them financially. He was so good and patient, even paternal, with his students. Guglielmi also recalled, but sometimes, when he didn't like their behavior, he became extremely strict. One day, a young and well-regarded pianist, Rosenthal, came to the maestro's Villa d'Este studio. There he came across Maestro Pizzina, a friend of the house and someone who Liszt thought a great deal of. Having already met the young pianist a few days earlier, but not having heard him play, Pizzina asked him if he would play something. The young pianist, a little annoyed, a little surprised and perhaps a little offended by the request, gave a rather rude refusal. Liszt, who came into the studio right at that moment, saw the incident and, turning to the youngster, tersely ordered him to play until he returned and left the studio. And the poor pianist had to play for quite some time until the maestro returned. Many pupils fell madly in love with Liszt, who, despite his advancing years, kept the good looks which gave him a reputation, well-deserved, as a great seducer. One of his most passionate lovers was the Russian Cossack Olga Yanina. It is said that to escape her, Liszt found a secure hiding place in Villa d'Este, a long way from where she could find him. But it didn't work. In fact, a few days after his arrival, a handsome young man arrived at Tivoli, who, with his arms full of flowers, threw himself at the musician's feet. It was her, dressed as a man. Another time, the young countess, displaying what we'd now call stalker behaviour, followed Franz everywhere, even showing up armed and ready to kill him because he didn't succumb to her flattery. Fortunately, in the end, the young woman chose the pen as her weapon and decided to gain revenge for the affront by publishing 2 scandalous volumes, Les Souvenirs d'un Cosaque, The Memoirs of a Cossack, and Les Souvenirs d'un Pianiste, The Memoirs of a Pianist, which happily for Liszt weren't very successful. In 1879, Tivoli was hit by severe famine. Cardinal Hohenlohe and the mayor, Pietro Tomei, suggested to Liszt that he give a benefit concert, and he agreed. The news that Liszt would once again give a public concert, Nadine Helbig wrote, spread like wildfire from Rome, and people from Britain, America, and everywhere fought for the tickets. The number of wagons of the newly inaugurated steam tram grew, and they travelled non-stop up and down. And as a result, the main road, covered by innumerable vehicles, looked like a black stripe on the landscape. Tivoli hadn't seen crowds like these for centuries. The concert was held in the throne room at Villa d'Este on 30th December of the same year. Liszt chose his partners for the concert, Nadine Helbig, who played a piano version of the Héroïde funèbre, and Alfred Reisenauer, who performed his Tarantella to great acclaim. Finally, Franz sat at his instrument, placed his hands on the keys, and just by playing a few pieces, left the audience wonderstruck. They gave him a standing ovation. At the age of 68, he still had that magnetic charisma that set him apart at an early age as one of the greatest pianists of all time, perhaps the greatest. Liszt, along with his student August Stradal, was at Villa d'Este for the last time on 10th November 1885. He would die the following year in Bayreuth. The biographer Guy de Pourtalais wrote in his book The Life of Franz Liszt, "The angel of music's gravestone lies under the Bavarian rain." But you need to be at Villa d'Este and its highest terrace to see his musical soul ascend to heaven. There are men who by their very presence glorify some places forever, almost as if the walls contain pieces of their soul. A plaque has been added to the entrance courtyard of the villa to commemorate the great musician, and if you walk along the paths of the marvellous garden, climb the steep steps that lead to his apartments, and go into his rose room, you can't help but imagine the slender figure of the great musician and his restless soul that found peace and serenity here. The podcast you've been listening to was written by Martina Santese. The voice was Alex Elton. The music was from Franz Liszt's works.
If you want to learn more about the things we've talked about today, or find out more about our project, visit our website at lirica.tv or our social media profiles at Lirica Music Art. Thank you for listening. We'll be back with new episodes and lots more content on art, culture, and music. Lirica is a project promoted by Voxfarm and financed by LazioInnova as part of the FESER Lazio 2014-2020 Regional Operating Program.